American Primeval debuted as the #1 show on Netflix, and as of recording this, it is still holding its position. For my reaction, I decided to dress up as a pioneer, and if you aren't familiar with me, I'm an ex-Mormon, and my ancestry has been very, very Mormon since Joseph Smith through one of the lines of my ancestry. And so I'm also embodying kind of how my ancestors likely looked as they crossed the plains to Utah. I grew up in a very devout family, and I also grew up hearing stories of the pioneers basically constantly. The Mormon pioneers. We heard about the wagon trains, what they ate, what games they played, what songs they sang. I heard these stories at home. I heard these stories at church, from scripture, at BYU, on my Mormon mission. There are so many aspects of Mormonism that are meant to really encourage an adoration of Mormon pioneers. And so that's why one of the reasons why the show is so interesting is because I can compare the very sanitized version of Mormon pioneers that I grew up with this depiction, which is not nearly so cheery. With that being said, the emphasis of this video will be on the Mormon aspect of American Primeval. There are multiple storylines, some of the native peoples, some of non-Mormon settlers, and so this video will be mostly a focus on the Mormon aspects of the show. To give an overview of the show, and if you haven't seen it and you don't want any spoilers at all, just know there will be some in this video. The beginning, I'm not going to give so many spoilers, and I'll alert you as to when the real spoilers are coming. But to give kind of a high-level overview, this show is set in 1857 and is a retelling of some of the groups of people who were warring over the land at that time. The primary groups that it shows are Native peoples, the US government, and the Mormons, both the settlers and the Mormon militia. This show is very brutal and very gory, so just know that going into it. I'm not going to show any gore in my reaction, but if you're going to choose to watch it, just know that that is very much a part of this show. It was also obviously very much a part of the West, and so, you know, we see a lot of that represented here. If you've seen The Revenant, the writer and a lot of the people who worked on The Revenant are the same as the people who worked on American Primeval, also a very gory show, so if you liked The Revenant with Leonardo DiCaprio, you'll love American Primeval. The show is a historical dramatization, and this is one of the primary criticisms coming from the Mormon Church, so I'm going to get into the article they wrote about it and a lot of the criticism surrounding it from a Mormon perspective. I'm going to get into my thoughts on how historical dramas are used to share a particular perspective. It's not a documentary, and so it is showing events in a dramatized way that does often lead to a particular conclusion about who's depicted. I'm also going to compare American Primeval with the movie Legacy, which was my main reference point for media about the Mormon pioneers that I had growing up. I watched this movie countless times, and so I'm going to compare some scenes from Legacy with scenes from American Primeval, and we're going to compare the kind of Mormon narrative through a historical drama and the non-Mormon Hollywood version of events. These two movies don't cover the same exact period of time, but there are a lot of similar themes. I am going to share too a lot of the history that inspired the show and try to get more into the details of what really happened, specifically during the Mountain Meadows Massacre. I'm not going to try to nitpick every single or go through with a fine-tooth comb every single inaccuracy, because we weren't promised a documentary, we were promised a historical dramatization, but I do want to share some of the history that inspired the show. As I said, the Mormon Church has a ton of media and events and scripture and stories about the Mormon pioneers. I had such a high adoration for the Mormon pioneers growing up. I also feel that I was fed a ultra sanitized version of events about, you know, what transpired for my ancestors to go from the east to the west to kind of hide out or escape religious persecution in Utah. One of the main ways they celebrate this is called Pioneer Day, which many say the celebrations of Pioneer Day in Utah are even bigger than the celebrations for the 4th of July. For this, they have parades where they have hand-drawn carriages. The Mormon leadership often comes out and joins the parades. There's fireworks, there's cookouts. Ex-Mormons refer to Pioneer Day as Pie and Beer Day, which is hilarious. To me, going to Pioneer Day honestly always felt a bit dystopian because there's really, to this day, not a lot of reckoning with what was actually quite a brutal colonization of Utah by the Mormons, specifically against the Native American people who were already there when they arrived, and the killing. I haven't been to a ton of Pioneer Days. I went to one a few years ago, and I have no memory of any representation of Native Americans. That's not to say it doesn't exist, but for the parade I went to, and then all of the kind of celebrations surrounding that, I didn't hear a whisper of, kind of the true historical reality of what the Mormon colonization was. In addition to the Pioneer Day celebration, there is also Trek. And Trek is essentially where Mormon youth go and cosplay or LARP as Mormon pioneers. I personally never did this because we moved a lot growing up, and so we moved before it happened in the area where I lived, and then where we moved to had just recently done it. They only do it every few years, and so I never participated in Trek. But to give a quick synopsis, essentially it's a 2 or 3 day youth activity with 12-year-olds to 18-year-olds, and then the adult leaders. They get hand carts, the girls dress up like I'm dressed up, the boys dress up in suspenders and hats, and oftentimes they get assigned a particular person. So you'd get a slip of paper that said, you will be Ephraim Smith, and he died of polio. You're kind of meant to embody that person or learn from their story. Not everyone does that, but that's a common activity. They start fires, they camp out. This often takes the form of a quite intense activity. There have been Mormon leaders who have died on these activities, not a lot, but it certainly has happened, whether it's because they didn't have enough water or heat exhaustion. And so they really do, this is not a bougie youth activity, they really do try to make it as hardcore as possible, and sometimes that has led to actually legitimately dangerous situations. As I mentioned previously, a movie I watched a ton growing up was the movie Legacy. This movie is also a historical drama, and there is nary a mention. They never mention 2 important elements of Mormon pioneers. One is Native Americans. Just like what I was talking about with Pioneer Day, they never mention or depict any Native American tribe in the movie Legacy. When I was growing up, I legitimately believed that there were no people in the Utah territory. What we did hear about was the elements, how it was very cold. A lot of people died of frostbite or being frozen. They didn't have a lot of food. I heard stories about how they would eat leather or how they used dung from animals to start fires. And so I definitely knew they experienced hardship, but my perception of the hardship was always about things that didn't involve the Mormons being the aggressor. So no mention of any Native peoples in the movie Legacy, no depiction. Also no depiction of polygamy, which is another huge aspect of the Mormon pioneers. A major reason they had to flee the United States to begin with was because of their polygamist practices. To contrast, American Primeval heavily contends, especially with the Mormons' interactions with the Native peoples, and it also does mention and bring up polygamy. It doesn't contend with it as much as it does kind of highlight the stories of Native peoples.
So, how is it you Mormons divvy up the women? 2 apiece?
Like shoes. 1 for each foot.
12 a pop, I hear.
Beg your pardon?
Is that true?
My wife Abish and I were just wed. Brother William's wives, Oakland and Esri, and Sister Alvin's not betrothed to anyone at the moment.
How much for her?
So Sister Pratt and Brother Pratt are not polygamists, but he does reference that the other people in their party, there's 2 wives already. And I also like how much they show how the non-members are really teasing them and making fun of them, and this happens throughout the show, just mocking them for their polygamous beliefs, which, as I've read a lot of the history about Mormons, was really common. This was the most odd and peculiar aspect of their religion, at least that other people knew about. It seems like a lot of the mockery, like this poster, was always about how the Mormons just wanted to have as much sex as possible, and the Mormons viewed themselves as being very chaste and following the direction of God. I also think this depiction where they are very dirty, they look really tired, is much more accurate to probably how it really was for American pioneers to cross to the West. Here's a wedding scene from Legacy where we see a man and wife getting married.
I bless you with long life and prosperity. Amen.
Oh, monogamy.
Verily I say unto you, whatsoever ye shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven.
So she's actually quoting from the Bible there, and this is a scripture that Mormons use from the Bible to legitimize the need for temple sealings. When you get married in a Mormon temple, the belief is that you are sealed to that person so that in the afterlife you'll still be together. And they use this verse from the Bible to show that this sealing power has existed long before Mormons came around. But as you can see, it's all smiles, it's all monogamy, and this is kind of just a short clip to represent how I viewed the Mormon pioneers, which is that they were just faithful, righteous people looking for a way to practice their faith in safety. I'll put the link to Legacy below. It's about an hour long, and like I said, in that hour they have no mention or depiction or even hint of polygamy. And so for me now, knowing a bit more history, if I'm comparing American Primeval and Legacy, American Primeval already has a leg up on portraying a more accurate depiction of what the Mormon pioneers were like. Before we continue, just a quick reminder to like this video, consider subscribing to my channel. I have a new video every single week where I share something about Mormon culture, Mormon doctrine, my history as a very devout member of the Mormon faith. So don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel if you want to see that every single week. The next scene in the movie shows that the date is 1844, and so by this point, Joseph Smith was married to at least 36 women, likely more. And so the polygamy was definitely happening around the time where this movie is showing us, history, but of course there is no mention of it. All of this to say is that there is a huge obsession with pioneers in Mormonism, and so it is always really interesting to see, just to see the media produced by non-Mormon voices around this time and around this topic, but then also to witness the reaction to that media and all the criticism that comes with it. Let's get into the first clip I wanted to share. This will definitely begin the portion of the video that has a lot more spoilers, so just be warned, there are major spoilers coming. To give context, we're going to see Brigham Young, who was the prophet of the church at that time, riding into a place called Fort Bridger. He's attempting to purchase the fort from Jim Bridger, who is the person who erected the fort and is kind of running the fort and owns the fort. Jim Bridger is not a member, and he is not a fan of Brigham Young.
And here he comes. All smiles and Jesus. Hoping I won't notice the concurrent twist he's trying to give my balls.
Likely has a discussion of mine over that pig business.
Yeah, I imagine so. Seeing as God's most probably whispered in his ear that all pigs in the territory have been bestowed as Mormon pork.
So then what exactly is your price, Mr. Bridger?
I'd have to see where leaving this place puts me.
I will be on my way in the morning, Mr. Bridger. My hope is that you will provide me with an answer before I depart.
It sounds as though your mention of hope should have an or else tacked on to the end.
Brigham Young, who is depicted here as Kim Coates, is a major person within Mormonism. I'm going to share his story in a minute, but the reason I wanted to highlight this at the top is to illustrate how much I like this depiction of Brigham Young, but also Mormons within the show. I like that Jim Bridger says, all pork is Mormon pork, and then he also says that he thinks that Brigham Young kind of is saying, or should say, or else at the end of his statement, and that depiction to me kind of encapsulates how the show portrays Brigham Young and also the Mormon militia, which is that they ask in a way that feels like a tell, and also reminds me of my upbringing and how I always viewed Mormons as the ones who were experiencing religious persecution, and Mormons as the ones who always had the mobs after them and so much unfairness happening. But in reading history, I feel like this depiction is much more accurate because it really shows how much Mormons seem to believe that God really had given them the Utah Territory, God gave them Missouri, really God gave them all of the entire planet, because if Mormons are the religion of God and Jesus Christ, then they kind of do own anything the light touches. To me, this is the same as if I were to come to your house and say, give me your house, please. Please give me your house peacefully. And if you said no, and then I attacked you, I would say, well, I wanted this to be peaceful. I said, I asked nicely first. You could have just given it to me. So this incident here where you're attacking me is really your fault and you're the aggressor here because I asked for peace. And this element of kind of asking in a way that's polite, but is obviously a demand, I think does seem to play out quite a bit in the Mormons' history with colonizing Utah, where often in my research I'll see it posed as, Brigham Young tried to make peace with the Native Americans or the Native people there, but when violence broke out because the peace they were trying to make was, can you peacefully give us your lands? And then the Native Americans fought back, it was posed as, they're the ones who are here for violence, or they're the ones that started this to begin with, when really the Mormons are the ones who are colonizing and overtaking the lands to begin with. And so what Jim Bridger gets at here is, to me, very in the spirit of what I saw in my research, which is that, someone may very well say, give me something, which is to ask for something politely because you believe it's your God-given right that you possess what other people possess. It's still an aggressive act. As you saw Brigham Young in the show, here's a photo of him from the show played by Kim Coates, and then here are 3 different photos of him when he was younger. When I saw Brigham Young growing up, it was always him with the big burly beard, as kind of depicted as him when he had more fully colonized and settled Utah with the Mormon people, but him here in the show and in these photos are when he was still kind of at the beginning of the journey of figuring out how to overtake Utah. And so he's much younger. He still has a lot of ground to cover as far as settling Salt Lake. I really liked the actor they chose, and I loved how the actor portrayed Brigham Young kind of as a Mormon mobster who's coming in and overtaking and saying, hey, this is going to be mine now, whether you like it or not. And I think that his depiction felt to me like a really accurate and great depiction, in my opinion. You may be wondering how we get from Joseph Smith to Brigham Young, and that is its own story, but to summarize, there are not countless literally, but there are so many breakoff groups from Joseph Smith's original church that he founded in 1830. After Joseph Smith was killed in Carthage jail, there was a huge scuffle to try to figure out who would get to kind of take the reins of the church. Some people said it should go through lineage, so Joseph Smith's children should take the reins. Other prominent leaders said that they should have the responsibility of being prophet. And the Brighamite group is the primary breakoff group, which I was part of, the LDS Church. That's the largest sect to have come from Mormonism, but it's certainly not the only one. During the scuffle of who would take over, Brigham Young essentially stood up, and when he was saying that he should be the one to take over after Joseph Smith, people in the audience said that he was more or less transfigured to have the countenance or to look like Joseph Smith himself, and this was a sign that Brigham Young was kind of called of God to be the true leader of the Mormon Church, which spawned even more breakoffs. What I think is crazy about that is that when Rulon Jeffs of the FLDS died, Warren Jeffs had the same explanation for why he should take over. So he stood up in front of his congregation and said, I am the embodiment of my dad, Rulon Jeffs, and if you can't see that I'm basically him in my countenance, then you don't have enough faith. And then people started standing up and saying, I see Rulon Jeffs. So in the same way Brigham Young basically overtook the largest sect of the early Mormons, the FLDS trade-off from Rulon to Warren Jeffs happened in essentially the same manner. After Joseph Smith was killed, Brigham Young decided to retreat even further away from the US government. I have a few videos sharing some of what they experienced as they they went from place to place. Basically, anywhere they would go, a lot of people would say, "We don't want you here." Some of the reasons for that were because of polygamy. Some were ex-members coming and saying, "Hey, these people aren't what you think they are." Some of it was because the Mormons would try to overtake public roles in the government, or, it'd be a small town and suddenly many thousands of Mormons would kind of settle on the town and say, "God gave us this land." And so there's a whole history as to why the Mormons were, jumping from place to place, getting kicked out of where they were trying to settle. Mormons not being welcome where they tried to settle is what fueled a lot of the paranoia that we see in the Mormons within American Primeval. At this point, they've been kicked out of so many places and had so many people dislike them that they kind of seem to assume that there's going to be violence against them. And so this sense that people were going to try to attack them, all people, all the time, and all places, this sense was what kicked off the events that we see happen in episode 1 with the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Brigham Young, as I said, decided to take the Saints to the west, and at this point it was still part of Mexico. The United States purchased Utah in 1848, and the show takes place in 1857. And so this area is still basically a pretty recent acquisition of the United States government. In 1850, the Utah Territory was recognized by Congress, and as a result, Brigham Young was recognized as the governor of the territory. Going into the show, I didn't realize that the United States government had recognized Brigham Young as part of the governor of the territory, and we definitely see this tension in the show between the United States military and the Mormons, where they're both kind of saying, "We both have claim on this territory." The Mormons saying, "We've been here since before the United States government ever laid claim on this land," and the United States government saying, "Well, we are the ones who get to recognize you as being legitimate. You don't have that recognition separate from our authority." And so there's a huge conversation that takes place about who has right to the land. And of course, the third group of people that we see saying they have the right to the land is the Native Americans, who, as we know, were there before the Mormons and before the United States government, and they are now trying to protect their lands and stake their claim and say, "We deserve to be here, we were here first." Mormons arrived in the Salt Lake Valley in 1847, and so American Primeval shows us a depiction of Mormons where they had already been in this land for about a decade. This means the Mormons had already killed or displaced a lot of the native peoples who lived in that area before the US government even gets there. An example of this I wanted to highlight is the battle at Fort Utah. The Wikipedia page is called the Battle at Fort Utah, but it's also called the Provo River Massacre. And I think calling it a massacre after learning about what happened, a massacre feels much more accurate as a word to describe what happened than a battle. I suggest reading the whole story of what happened, but to summarize, essentially a member of the Timpanogos tribe was accused of stealing a garment, a piece of clothing from a Mormon man, and as a result, some of the Mormon men chose to kill him. In retaliation for this murder, the Timpanogos people chose to steal about 50 of the Mormons' cattle. After the event with the stolen cattle, about 90 Mormon militiamen called the Nauvoo Legion, and we also see the Nauvoo Legion playing a huge role in American Primeval. This same militia was involved in this Provo River Massacre. These 90 militiamen surrounded the Timpanogos people and laid siege on them, which ended up killing about between 40 and 100 of the Timpanogos people. The people who were killed were mostly men and one woman. After this massacre, they took about 40 more men, women, and children. They took them as prisoner and later sold them as slaves to Mormon families in the Salt Lake Valley. The Provo River Massacre happened about 7 years before anything we see in American Primeval, and is really just one event like this. There are multiple events like this, and when I heard about the Provo River Massacre and the Mountain Meadows Massacre, I think what's frustrating is that the Mountain Meadows Massacre has always made headlines, newspapers, even when it happened and after it happened, Mark Twain wrote about it, and I think my frustration with how much coverage the Mountain Meadows Massacre gets is that it often feels motivated by the fact that Mormons killed other white settlers. while the Provo River Massacre is where the Mormons killed indigenous people, and it doesn't receive nearly the same recognition. And my theory for this, which many have postulated, is purely because white people seem to care more when white people kill white people, when Mormons kill other, white settlers trying to go to California, versus when white people kill Native Americans, Mormons kill Native Americans, because that is kind of the tapestry of all of American settlement. And this focus of the media to cover the Mountain Meadows Massacre, to me, I think it's very good that we know about this history. I'm about to get into the story. It is a absolutely heartbreaking and wild story. I do find it frustrating the level to which there's so much more coverage and people know about it so much more than all of these other instances of Mormons waging violence against Native peoples, because it just obviously reveals a very lopsided approach to what we should care about as people. I believe that the story of the Provo River Massacre and the story of all Native peoples who experienced violence and enslavement and death at the hands of Mormons or any settlers are stories that we should hear proclaimed from the loudspeakers, proclaimed from all the highest mountains, because those stories matter just as much. Those lives matter just as much as the lives of other white settlers who we learn about in the Mountain Meadows Massacre. This history of manifest destiny in the United States is very well documented, manifest destiny being the point of view that God had given these lands to the settlers who arrived on its shores through boats from Europe. And manifest destiny is essentially the idea that we, being white Anglo-Saxons, deserved to have these lands as our God-given right. And I think that's why Mormonism is said to be a very American religion or version of Christianity, is because Mormonism is kind of manifest destiny in its most outrageous and religious version of itself. Before we continue, a reminder that if you want to see all my YouTube videos early and ad-free, you can always find them on my Patreon. I post all of my YouTube videos there. I also post additional kind of bonus content, sharing stuff that is kind of more personal stories or personal updates, photos, behind the scenes. And so if you want to see bonus content or just all of my videos ad-free and early, you can find them on my Patreon. Another major theme that's explored in the show American Primeval that I wanted to highlight is the concept of Zion. And this is basically the Mormon version of manifest destiny, is the idea that they should be finding Zion. Here's a clip that touches on the Mormons' journey from Joseph Smith to the West and their interest in forming Zion.
We have endured anguish and pain to reach our Zion. And yet still, they follow with their persecution. We have been trying long enough with our enemies. And I go in for letting the sword of the Almighty be unsheathed in word and in deed. For we have reached Zion, our Zion.
Zion, Zion. I say Zion. A lot of Mormons will say Zion. I'm going to say Zion. That's just how I pronounce it. The word Zion is mentioned 210 times in the Doctrine and Covenants. The Doctrine and Covenants being one of the 4 books of Scripture, Book of Mormon, Bible, Pearl of Great Price, which I'm talking about the Pearl of Great Price next week, so don't forget to subscribe, and the Doctrine and Covenants. The Doctrine and Covenants is early church history, mostly about Joseph Smith, where he talks a lot about settling, finding, and staying in Zion. This Mormon concept of Zion is not the exact same as Zionism within Judaism, but there are some similarities. Mormons aren't trying to go back and establish a community in Israel. What they are trying to do is they're searching for a land where they can establish their own holy community. And this is a concept where the land is basically going to its rightful owners, that this is God-appointed land for them to build a holy city, and that Mormons, being God's chosen people and having the gospel, that they basically have a claim on this land as their God-given right. Zion in Mormonism does have multiple meanings. It's a place mentioned in the Book of Mormon. It's also a state of mind. So so, Zion is kind of a state of being you can exist in, of righteousness and holiness and reverence to the Lord. So it's not just a physical place, it's also a spiritual place. Joseph Smith actually said that Zion can be found in Adam-on-Diamond, which is in Missouri. So here's a picture. I've told stories about how my family took a vacation to go to see Adam-on-Diamond in Missouri. This is also where Joseph Smith said, where the Garden of Eden was. This is also where Adam and Eve will gather the saints back when it is time for the second coming. I love that in American Primeval, they actually have one of the Mormon characters sing the song Adam-on-Diamond, because this is a hymn I sang growing up. This song is about how Missouri was once the Garden of Eden, and about how when it's the second coming that the earth will be renewed and afford the saints a holy home. So the belief is that when it's the second coming, all the Mormons are actually going to go back to where Joseph Smith said, this is a really important place. This is the Garden of Eden. This is where the saints will gather in preparation for the second coming. So in my opinion, Joseph Smith was just kind of having his revelations all the time. And so as the saints were going from place to place, he would just say, this place used to be the Garden of Eden, and I believe this is my revelation. So I think that the fact that it's in Missouri is just because that's just where Joseph Smith kind of happened to be at the time. But that is a really significant aspect of Mormon belief. And Joseph Smith also said that Adam-on-Diamond is Zion. It's kind of one of the reasons that people didn't really like the Mormons that much, was that they'd roll up to a place where there already were people and they would say, hey, this is Zion. God gave us this land. And when the people said, I think that this is my house. People, the Mormons would kind of say, well, you're denying me my religious right to practice my religion by settling here and having all of this land to myself. And so I think that's the very dangerous aspect of this doctrine of Zion, is that it gives land to the believers because the land is God's land, so it's the believers' land. Whoever happens to be on that land, like in Missouri, it was the Missourians, in Utah, it was the native peoples or the United States government trying to lay hold on the land. And so the danger of Zion is that it makes it so that, hey, this is mine. Whether it actually is in reality or not, in a religious sense, Zion means that they have a religious claim on the land, whether there is a legal claim or not. The term Zion has also been applied to Kirtland, Ohio, Jackson County, Missouri, which I mentioned, Nauvoo, Illinois, and by Brigham Young, it was applied to the Salt Lake Valley. And so I really liked in American Primeval how they pose Brigham Young as just kind of walking around like he owns the place, because in his mind, he really does. And so the concept of Zion really goes all the way back to Joseph Smith. There's also all these maps that Joseph Smith drew of establishing Zion and how it would be a perfect city. This is also why Salt Lake was designed on a grid system. It's similar to this map that Joseph Smith drew here. There's this YouTube video that I suggest that actually has a really interesting and thorough explanation as to why Salt Lake was designed like this. But the Cliff Notes version is that they believe that this city design was divinely inspired and was how Zion was meant to be set up. What you also probably noticed in that clip is that Brigham Young is recounting the violent past of how people were persecuting the Mormons. So we had the Missouri Extermination Order, which came from Governor Boggs, which was really the only time this ever happened in American history, where he said, we're going to kill all the Mormons. There is also Hans Mill, which is depicted in the movie Legacy. The killing of Joseph Smith was also shown in a few of those illustrations. And there were really just a lot of skirmishes involving the Mormons and the local people where people ended up getting killed. And I talked about this quite a bit in one of my videos about Joseph Smith. If you want to hear more about that history, I suggest checking it out. By the time we're at American Primeval, though, a lot of that is more just stories they're sharing back and forth as kind of evidence to why there are so many aggressors against Mormons. And it's fueling, in my opinion, and what kicked off the Mountain Meadows Massacre, this almost obsession with how persecuted the Mormons have been, and that they've been so persecuted by so many people that they should kind of assume persecution and act first, rather than sitting around and waiting for someone to commit violence against them. And this is where I think we see in American Primeval how the Mormons very much become the aggressors in these instances, because they're drawing from all of this lore of just how persecuted they've always been to say that we need to be much more proactive in protecting ourselves from the government or from really anyone who isn't a member, any outsider who happens to come through our land. Pulling from my upbringing, though, I always perceived that Mormons were never the aggressor, and that the reason there was so much religious persecution was because that the doctrine that Joseph Smith taught was blasphemous, essentially. So here's a clip from Legacy that I think really depicts my perception of how the early Mormons experienced persecution.
2 years ago, half a dozen of these Mormons arrived in Upper Missouri. Now they number 1,200. They are superstitious and opposed to slavery. And how about that Joe Smith speaking to God and his angels? Blasphemy. In no time you will have a Mormon sheriff. We propose this declaration. No Mormon shall move and settle in this county. Their leaders shall prevent any further immigration of their distant brethren. The Mormon printing office shall be closed.
The angry mob.
Get in trouble, get everyone out.
Eliza, take the children. Go!
And in the scene, we see that one of the men gets tarred and feathered. And so if you listen to the script there, first thing to highlight is how he says, "What about Joe Smith speaking to those angels? It's blasphemy." That line is really what I perceived as the reason why people didn't like Mormons. The blasphemy of it all. He also does some fear-mongering in this, that the Mormons are going to overtake the government. Joseph Smith did try to run for president. And so Mormon leaders did explicitly have the goal to get into U.S. governmental leadership. So Joseph Smith was going to be the president, or he's trying to be. He was also the mayor of Nauvoo. Brigham Young went on to be in governmental leadership in Utah. And even to this day, Mormons have an outsized impact on Utah lawmaking. There are more Mormons in the Utah government than there are represented in the percentage of Mormons in the population at this point. The quote about slavery is interesting, and I think obviously a clear attempt to get some sympathy from the modern viewer who now in modernity, everyone is very opposed to slavery. Slavery was still part of the United States at that point. Joseph Smith actually flip-flop on his views of slavery throughout his life. He also taught that Black people were cursed because of the curse of Cain in the Bible. And so to me, this, he doesn't believe in slavery is obviously, in my opinion, meant to get the audience on his side, when his actual views on Black people were much more murky than just as a pure abolitionist. Anyways, all of that to say is that everything that this angry mobster lists as reasons to persecute the Mormons are things that a modern audience really wouldn't take that much issue with necessarily. The angry dude doesn't say anything about, what about polygamy? No, because that isn't something a modern viewer would ultimately agree with or stand by. And so I find that the reasons why we shouldn't like the Mormons, that list there, is really kind of calculated to make the audience like Joseph Smith, which is not surprising considering it's produced by the church, but it does feel very one-sided. I fully believed that people didn't like Joseph Smith because he was just such a good guy. And the only reason Mormons ever took up arms is because they had to protect themselves. They were, in my opinion, just as much the aggressor, if not often more of the aggressor than the people who they were having these skirmishes with. Also, the skirmishes half the time were with ex-members who had been baptized and then had been so wronged that they decided to come back and speak out against the Mormons. I mean, that's kind of what happened in Nauvoo. That's what happened with the death of Joseph Smith. He ordered a printing press that was trying to expose him for polygamy. He ordered it to be burned to the ground, and then he was incarcerated as a result of his destruction of property. And so a lot of these stories, if you dig into the details, you can find that the Mormons often also were to blame in a lot of these instances. And they weren't just these, pure church folk who only wanted to just live in righteousness. They were doing things to antagonize the people around them. Speaking of the Mormon church, as we obviously have been, if you're in the process of leaving the Mormon church, or if you're just curious to learn more about my story as I was leaving, I suggest checking out my book, How to Leave the Mormon Church. I'll put a link for it below. Here are some reviews for it. I put everything I learned as part of leaving the church into this book, from how to tell your parents to how to order your first cup of coffee for the very first time when you walk into a coffee shop. I've had people who have been ex-Muslim or ex-Jehovah's Witness who have read the book and said that it really helped them on their own kind of faith deconstruction and rebuilding. So if that sounds interesting to you, I suggest checking out my book. And now let's get back to American Primeval. When the Deseret News says we don't like American Primeval because it's a historical drama and they're taking all these liberties and they're trying to paint Mormons as crazy and kooky and violent, but then we see them take great liberties in their own media to not depict Native Americans and to not depict polygamy and to paint Joseph Smith as this great church guy that just wanted to help people come closer to Jesus Christ. I think that the criticism about, well, we shouldn't have historical dramatizations because it really takes such liberties and there's so much bias that we shouldn't watch it to begin with because, they're just trying to prove a point. This criticism about using media in order to convince someone of a perspective can definitely be applied to media like Legacy. So we'll get to my criticisms there, but we're going to talk first about the absolutely horrendous story of the Mountain Meadows Massacre, which is in episode 1 of American Primeval and is also kind of the founding point of all of the drama that we see take place in the next 5 episodes after that initial event that really spurs all the rest of the drama. I'm not going to show any clips, like I said, of the massacre itself as shown in American Primeval, purely because it's so gory. If you want to watch it, go ahead and go watch it. But here is the conversation that takes place between the settlers in the wagon party and the Mormon militia as shown in American Primeval.
Bancher, we got riders.
Get my gun. Who the hell's this? Cavalry?
Nah, Mormon militia.
Hello, friend.
Slow back. Point out who's in charge of this party.
How can I help you?
You in charge?
I am.
All right. You possess a permit to be on these lands?
Permit?
By proclamation of Governor Brigham Young, no person shall be allowed to pass through this territory without a permit provided by a proper officer. Going through
Friend, you can assure Governor Young that we're going to be out of here first light. He'll never knew we were here.
Well, I'm afraid it don't work like that.
Governor Young has declared martial law to protect his people due to you and your kind driving us out of our homes, killing our loved ones.
Well, we found that place. Mister, you're standing on it.
As I understand it, I'm standing on land owned by the United States government.
So as you can see so far, the person who's leading the party, the wagon train, is being very polite. We don't have, an audio recording. There were no cameras back when this really happened in history, so we don't know that they were this polite, obviously. But as you can see, at least how it's depicted here in this historical drama, the person is saying, hi, we're just passing through, we'll be on our way. And the Mormons are doing a bit of a shakedown to say, you need a permit, you can't be here, you need to move right now. Here's what the conversation devolves into.
Keep talking about your proclamation. I do hear you. I'm not deaf. Only problem is that we have our own proclamation. And that proclamation says that we take orders from no man. Especially a goddamn Mormon, or that thing there, whatever that is. So you can tell, friend, you want to start shooting, I got 60 guns back here, ready to go. And I got some real fine shots in the lot. And he's real bored. He ain't been shooting nothing but, what you been shooting, Cole?
So it devolves into guns being pulled out and harsh words being exchanged. The Mormons in the scene end up leaving, and the wagon train says it's gonna be fine, whatever. They're gonna leave us alone now. And not soon after this, we see the depiction of the Mountain Meadows Massacre take place, which is that those men, the Mormon militia that you saw on horses, come back with hoods over their heads and essentially kill almost everyone in that wagon train in a very gory and bloody depiction as shown in the show. If you want to see how it happens in the show, I definitely suggest watching it if you know you can stomach all the violence, but I'm going to share the story according to history of how this played out according to historians and according to documents that have been uncovered since the event. The Mountain Meadows Massacre was one of the most notable events to happen during the Utah War. During this time, there was a large swath of the US military which was dispatched by President Buchanan. When President Buchanan sent these troops to Utah, the Mormons took it as a sign that they might be annihilated or have some sort of a war again, just like they had in all of these different other instances between the Mormons and the US government. So when President Buchanan sent this force, the Mormons prepared for war. As part of this response from the Mormons, the governor, Brigham Young, who we've been talking about, decided to declare martial law. And I'll put all the words of the martial law dispatch in the links below. But essentially, he said, hey, the US government is coming to kill us. I'm declaring martial law. And it created in Utah this really heightened sense of fear amongst the Mormons. The government was coming. They had declared martial law. And so there was a really high level of fear running through Mormons in Utah during that time. To read from the statement about martial law, Brigham Young said that first, he forbids all armed forces of every description from coming into the territory under any pretense. Second, that all forces in the territory hold themselves in readiness to march at a moment's notice to repel any and all such invasion. So he's saying, hey, Nauvoo Legion, be ready to march against the US government. And third, martial law is hereby declared to exist in this territory from and after the publication of this proclamation, and no person shall be allowed to pass or repass into or through from this territory without a permit from the proper officer. So what we see in this dialogue between the militia and the wagon train is that, hey, Brigham Young, the governor of this territory, said that you have to have a permit in order to be traveling here. This wagon train in history was called the Baker-Franker Emigrant Wagon Train. And so they were trying to go to California. Most of them were from Arkansas, and they were trying to travel to California. So they were really just passing through. This was around a similar time as the California Gold Rush, if you're wondering, because I feel like I learned so much about the Gold Rush in school that that's one of my anchor points to why people were traveling to California. Historians say the Gold Rush happened between 1848 and 1855. This is 1857, so there are definitely still large swaths of people attempting to travel to California. The show does depict some Mormons being in this wagon train. In reality, there were no Mormons at all in the wagon train. Apparently, as the party was traveling, there were some rumors that this wagon train had displayed some unsavory feelings towards Mormons. That was just some of the rumors that were going around. And so once this wagon train was camped out, two leaders decided to make plans to attack the wagon train. The Mormons did convince some Native Americans, specifically the Paiutes, to join them in this attack. This is also shown in the show, American Primeval. They disguise themselves to try to convince the party that they're attacking that the attack is just from Native Americans and that the Mormons aren't involved at all. And so in history, in the full version of events, the Mormons dress up as Native Americans and they lay siege on this wagon train. After they attacked, they were surprised by how well the wagon train fought back, and there was a 5-day siege in which the Mormons and some Native Americans, the Paiutes, were attempting to kill the members of the wagon train. During this 5-day siege, because it was so long and drawn out, The Mormons became convinced that people in the wagon train had seen their true identities and knew at this point that the people who were attacking them mostly were Mormons and not entirely made up of a group of Native Americans. What happens next is not something they show in the TV show, and is also why I use the word paranoia, because they became convinced that they needed to destroy any evidence that this had taken place. And so they told the remaining settlers who hadn't been killed yet that they were going to let them go. They said, we're going to let you go in peace. We're going to let you pass, out of your wagon train, and you can walk away from this and you're good. This was convincing enough that the people remaining in the wagon train believed the Mormons saying this. They laid down their arms and they decided to walk away out of their protection, out of, anything they had set up. They chose to leave the wagon train and perceived that they were walking to safety. After the people were fully out of the camp and completely unprotected, the militia, along with people who were hidden, stepped out and killed the remainder of the people who had survived the siege. In this final act of violence, they killed every single person who was remaining except for 17 children who were under the age of 7. So there were kids who they said, should we kill them? Should we not kill them? And they decided to kill anyone that was older than 7 because they were so worried and freaked out that there would be a witness to all of this murder that they had chosen to take part in. And so the only kids who remained were those under 7. In the show, they depict this as something that just happens in maybe 30 minutes or less. It's a very fast scene where all of the killing happens very quickly. In reality, this was much more long and drawn out. And what's crazy after watching American Primeval and then knowing the real story, which is that they tricked them to leave their safety and then killed them in cold blood with no protection, including children over 7 and under 18. It means that what they show in American Primeval is actually going easy on what the Mormons did. The reason that the Mormons dressed up as Native Americans, in case it isn't already clear, just because you could probably assume why they did that, is because they wanted to pin the murders, the killings, entirely on the Native Americans. So after this happened, and when this report of what had happened, these people who had been killed, initially went out, it was completely pinned on the Native Americans. And this report that Brigham Young made to the US government 100% pits the blame on the Native Americans as the people who, originated the violence, decided to make it happen, committed the acts. So the Mormons did try to stick with their initial plan to say, we're not taking any of the blame for this, and we're going to pin it entirely on the Native Americans. And they did try to stick with that narrative for quite a while until there were other voices that rose to say that it actually was mostly the Mormons. There were several men who were involved in this massacre who were ultimately indicted and tried for their participation as the Mormon leadership who planned these murders and were kind of the ringleaders of this event. Only one was ever tried in a court of law, and that was John D. Lee. From what I can tell, he was kind of chosen to be the fall guy of this whole thing. We'll get into a bit how much Brigham Young knew about what was going on both before, during, and after this event, but it seems that really of all of those many awful murders, only one person was ever held accountable. He was executed by firing squad in 1877. Another interesting fact that I saw was that after the event, they let some of those little children live. Those kids then saw some of the articles of clothing or jewelry that had been on the bodies of the people who were killed. They saw that later on around the Salt Lake Valley. This does become an element of American Primeval because there's a pocket watch that one of the Mormon leaders takes after the killings, and then later someone else, Brother Pratt, sees the watch and puts 2 and 2 together and figures out the only reason you have that is because you looted one of the bodies. And so I like that they were true to that element of history. And I also just thought, how crazy is it that they were killing all these people and then also took all of their stuff with them? Obviously, they're not really destroying evidence if they're literally wearing the earrings and jewelry and rings and coats of the people who were killed. So there's just not a lot of, as far as covering up their tracks. They didn't do a very good job. So the Mormon Church did release a statement through Deseret News about American Primeval, because they always have something to say, of course. I definitely recommend reading it because it's quite an interesting piece of journalism. The biggest criticism, which I said at the top of this video, is that because the show's authors, whoever made the show, claims and says it's a historical dramatization, that they can kind of say whatever they want, and because they're taking artistic liberties, we should discount the show because they're not showing real history, and there's an attempt to kind of recast history in a way that shows Mormons as strange polygamists who are violent. I will say, fair enough, and even ex-Mormons and people who aren't Mormon have said this show isn't true exactly to history, so, you know, take that for what it is. And I do totally understand that perspective, and I don't think that you should take anything that you see in historical dramas as history that you could be prepared for a history test to answer every single question correctly. However, in this article, they have their own retelling of the Mountain Meadows Massacre. To read directly, it says, "But at Mountain Meadows, Latter-day Saints and Paiutes exchanged shots with the immigrants, and some were killed." Some. There's no number. Some. Some of the Latter-day Saints knew they'd been recognized. One local leader sent a letter to Brigham Young for advice, but local leaders eventually made the decision to kill the witnesses on September 11th, 1857, 2 days before they received President Young's reply, "Let them go in peace." So that's their recounting. Let's analyze a bit the language they choose to use. First of all, the phrase "some were killed" is objectively true without being completely honest. So they don't give us a number. That's my most frustrating thing of this whole article, is they don't give us a number. And to be clear, at least American Primeval is coming forward and saying, this is a dramatization of history. They don't promise us historical accuracy. However, the Deseret News does proclaim to be news. News is not dramatization. News is telling you, I'm telling you the truth. To me, I find it quite ironic to see that the Deseret News, which is purporting to be a non-fiction bit of text for us to read, isn't completely truthful. So that's a bit hypocritical. To move onward though, I also find the use of local leaders to be interesting. So local leaders eventually made the decision to kill the witnesses. I find it interesting that they chose to use the term local leaders rather than Mormons. So Mormons eventually made the decision to kill the witnesses, or even LDS members made the decision. This is, to me, a way for them to give space between the church and, an identity as a member of the church, to just say the phrase local leader, which feels much less personal and feels a lot more like you can hold them at arm's length. And I find that also objectionable, because when you use language that holds the identity at arm's length, when those people who are members of the Mormon militia, this distancing language is also a bit of a misdirection, in my opinion. This paragraph from Deseret News definitely favors the church in its retelling, because while it is, I guess, somewhat accurate, because it doesn't present the full scope of what the Mountain Meadows Massacre was, if you only relied on the Deseret News for your information, then you wouldn't actually have a full picture of what happened. And so this is the author of the article engaging in the same behavior he's criticizing the producers of American Primeval of doing, which is to present a specific narrative that benefits your perspective. Hypocritical. It's hypocritical, but I feel like it's even worse because they're saying their news. I feel like that's important to note too. I also found this article from Public Square Magazine, which is another Mormon publication. It's not owned by the Mormon Church in the same way Deseret News is, but it's run by Mormons, and it's a pro-Mormon LDS publication. As you can see from the headline, they are taking issue with the prejudiced fiction of Brigham Young, and the subheadline, the subtext is, "Can Netflix's Primeval justify its fictional Brigham Young? No, it fosters cultural bias under artistic license." And this is why I'm so frustrated with members of the church and writing articles like this, because where's my article that says this about legacy? Where's my article that says that legacy, which does not depict a single Native American and does not depict polygamy, is fostering cultural bias under artistic license? And to me, the fact that they are willing to heavily criticize, this TV show coming out of Hollywood for misrepresenting history, but then that they also engage in the same behavior whenever it suits them, I find that to be really frustrating. And as someone who grew up in this religion and who grew up hearing these whitewashed stories about why we should honor the legacy of our Mormon pioneer ancestors, but never heard any of these unfavorable stories like about the Provo River Massacre, or if you look through any moments in history where Mormons were the aggressors, the fact that I never knew any of those stories shows that the church is engaging in the same behavior that it is criticizing, because it too presents a specific narrative in order for its own members to have a faithful perspective of its history. In addition, if you read through this article, you'll see that they don't contend with any of the moral issues raised by the show about the Mountain Meadows Massacre. So it's just more misdirection, where they're saying the reason you shouldn't watch this is because it's not historically accurate, not because what is the real issue in my mind, which is that it is showing a part of Mormon history that isn't faith promoting. And the fact that they can write an entire article about American Primeval without once mentioning the Mountain Meadows Massacre in the entire article shows that they are actually not contending with these issues on their face, but they're looking for the issue that they can portray in the most favorable light and then hitching their wagon to it and riding it into the sunset, rather than talking about the issues that are being brought to the forefront by this TV show being made to begin with. If you're going to criticize American Primeval for not being historically accurate, then I think you should at least have the intellectual dignity to post a similar article about legacy and its lack of historical accuracy. Now that I've had my rant, we're going back to Brigham Young. So my question coming out of watching the show was, what role in history did Brigham Young really play in the Mountain Meadows Massacre? Did he orchestrate it? Is he the one that said, let's go kill all these people? Or did he merely clean up the mess after it happened? From what I can tell, historians mostly agree that Brigham Young was not involved in the planning of the event or the event while it was happening, but some people conjecture that he verbally issued the orders, which we obviously wouldn't have any record of. And so because there's no paper record, Brigham Young can kind of hide behind the anonymity of, there's no proof that he was involved. And so we just don't seem to know. Most people seem to think he wasn't involved. Some people think he was. And so because there's no consensus, we'll just move on from that question. Brigham Young did excommunicate key participants. I already talked about John D. Lee. Isaac Height was also excommunicated in 1870. I take this, like I said, to kind of be that the government wanted someone to be accountable for this. And so these are the people Brigham Young chose to be the scapegoats. If I had to guess what happened, in my mind, I believe that Brigham Young created a culture and a sense of heightened fear and paranoia just around Utah by issuing the martial law statement. And so there was already an atmosphere of fear of outsiders that was really heightened during that time. I think that the Nauvoo Legion encountered these pioneers, and there was probably some snark back and forth coming from the pioneers, maybe a joke about polygamy or two. The Mormon militia, based off this heightened sense of fear of outsiders, chose to orchestrate the Mountain Meadows Massacre, which went way wrong. It didn't go the way they had planned, with a 5-day siege and then all of these survivors that they had to take care of and then choose who to kill. I think after this happened, Brigham Young tried to continue on with the lie, and when that didn't work, he chose a few of the people who were involved to kind of pay the price, only one who was ever tried in a court of law. The first nationwide interest and publicity around this event happened in 1872, and from what I can tell, it really really captured a lot of people's attention and really has continued to dominate a lot of people's interests and perspectives about Mormons for a very long time. One of the most interesting pieces of publicity I found on the Mountain Meadows Massacre was in the book Roughing It by Mark Twain. He has several pages where he kind of covers this event and shows his interest in it. It seems like Mark Twain always had a passing interest in Mormons. He has several different times of his life where he was writing about them. He also famously called the Book of Mormon chloroform in print. So he really brought his wry sense of humor to the Mormon religion, which I really enjoy reading his writings. If you want to read this portion of Roughing It where he talks about the Mountain Meadows Massacre, I'll link it below. Even though Brigham Young excommunicated members and there was a lot of fallout after the Mountain Meadows Massacre, after the kind of initial fallout took place, the church didn't have any official recognition that this had happened, at least through 2007. And so that was the first time the church released a statement, its first official statement of regret on the topic. Brigham Young plays a pretty big role in the show, and this is the scene where he's first introduced to the audience.
It is an ignorant excitement that causes some people of the United States to feel and act toward us the way they do. But trust me, brothers, there is not an honest man among them who, if he could hear our doctrine taught without knowing it was Mormon, would not drink down those principles like a thirsty ox drinks down water. But an ignorant prejudice causes them to refuse, to persecute, to threaten us with war. But we cannot weaken.
As you can see, I really like how they're painting here the depiction of Brigham Young as someone who is fueling this paranoia, right? He's saying they're just persecuting us for our beliefs. I think that this cry of religious persecution is definitely something that I continue to see very prevalent in Mormon culture and Mormon discourse. I think many would say that the videos I make are its own form of religious persecution. And I mean, you say what you want. That's your right. But I do think that there's often a conflating between religious persecution and religious criticism. The idea that you can't criticize religion, and any act of criticism is in its own way an act of persecution, is really silencing the voices of ex-members like me, and is also ultimately somewhat anti-American, because just as much as Mormons love to claim their access to freedom of religion and to practice how they choose, I claim my right as an American to have free speech and to say, you know, whatever is coming out of my mouth, that's my right as an American too. And so to me, this opening statement that we see from Brigham Young, where he's kind of introducing the audience to this idea that Mormons have been so persecuted, and if they could only just believe in the doctrine, then they would love it, is kind of the same as my experience, believing that the reason people didn't like Mormons was because of the doctrine and not because of anything else they might have been involved with around that time.
To enjoy the blessings of this land. What? We can make it if we stay true to each other, true to our beliefs, and true to the church. So, during this time of our Reformation, when evil wants to pull us away from what brought us here, we must use a spirit of Zion to push that evil away. Push that evil away for not.
There's Zion again, and I think also the hypocrisy, because I've been talking about hypocrisy, the hypocrisy in what they are saying, which is that they are preaching, you should accept us. And this is continuing today. You should accept us. We're a religious minority. It's on you to accept us and our religion. But then not accepting the fact that the Native Americans had claim to the land back in this time, and not extending that same level of acceptance and love and dignity to other minority groups. Like I've had a video recently about people who are gay. They want respect that they're not willing to give. And that's why I think it's hypocrisy, because he's saying, why can't they just accept that we're special and we matter and we're humans too and we belong here? while also killing Native Americans for the land that they just arrived to. It's like the inability to recognize that the same rhetoric that you're using to defend yourself should also be used to defend the groups that you are treating very poorly, like Native Americans or women or gay people. And that's why I think Mormonism is so frustrating to me, is that it's like they can see it. It's like they're almost there. You can see that it's really frustrating for people to not accept you, and you really want acceptance and love and support. And yet, when you have a doctrine that goes against acceptance, love, and support of a different group that's not you, you don't stand by it. You don't stand by that principle. So it's very one-sided, and I think that I really can appreciate the way the script writers are writing in the religious indignance of persecution while also not being accepting and loving and polite and kind and all these other words to the Native Americans that we see portrayed in the show. As you can tell, Brigham Young is bringing back this idea of Zion to the forefront, their claim, their God-given claim on the land where they are now occupying. I wanted to show you the clip where one of the Mormon members, his name is Brother Pratt, he starts singing the song Adam on Diamond.
Such days to come, our Savior's second coming, when all the earth in glorious blue affords the saints of holy.
Need to do something about your Mormon friend.
He's been injured.
I did like that they chose to include a very Mormon hymn. This is a song I grew up singing, and singing was a huge part of the Mormon pioneer story in my mind. A lot of hymns that the Mormons still sing are either written by pioneers or just about pioneers. It's just a huge aspect of the religious tradition. As a child, I sang the song Pioneer Children Sang as They Walked. And to sing that, it says you're supposed to sing it cheerfully. It's not the best tune, but I only really remember the tune of the first few bars or lines or whatever. But the song is, pioneer children sang as they walked and walked and walked and walked. Pioneer children sang as they walked and walked and walked. The word walked shows up 13 times in this song, and it's 4 lines of a song. And then sometimes in primary, we would pretend to walk as we were singing this song. You know, that's my first introduction to a song about Mormon pioneers. The next is Come, Come Ye Saints. And this is probably the most famous in my mind. Another song I sang constantly when I went to Brigham Young University. Every hour they have this big bell tower, and every hour at the, when the bell rings at the top of the hour, it's the tune, the first few notes of Come, Come Ye Saints. So I'd be walking with my backpack and it'd be like, do, 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 do. And there's definitely a few gems from this song. Specifically in the 4th verse, it says, and should we die before our journey's through, happy day. All is well. We then are free from toil and sorrow too. With the just we shall dwell. But if our lives are spared again to see the saints their rest obtain, oh, how we'll make this chorus swell. All is well, all is well. So sometimes as a joke growing up, we'd sing, and if we die before our journey's through, happy day. And if that's not kind of religious zealotry, I don't really know what is, to be celebrating your own death. But I'll sing the first few lines of that song. It feels even more appropriate with me wearing this outfit and drinking my devil's bean juice. Come, come ye saints, no toil nor labor fear, but with joy wend your way. Though hard to you this journey may appear, grace shall be as your day. 'Tis better far for us to strive, our useless cares from us to drive. Do this and joy, your heart will swell. All is well, all is well. Which is, it's, all is well. It's a nice sentiment. You're walking and your toes are freezing off and you're like, if I die, happy day. I definitely recommend, if you're interested, reading all the lyrics from that song, because they're just interesting because, you know, they're just really singing about the pioneers' experience going across the plains. As we round the bend, I wanted to share my favorite character depicted in the show, which is Jim Bridger. He's the one who owns Fort Bridger. This is played by the actor Shea Wingham. An interesting fact I uncovered in my research is that Jim Bridger is portrayed in both The Revenant and in American Primeval. So in The Revenant, we see him as a younger man, kind of just coming up into his own, and then we see him later with his fort completely built. And so I liked that since the writer is writing, you know, both these stories and they're both taking place at similar times in a similar part of the West, we see this person portrayed twice in both the pieces of media. This clip is of the first time that Brigham Young meets Jim Bridger.
Step beneath you, Governor. I'm afraid we don't do such things out here. Not even for the women.
Just getting a lay of the land.
Why? Mostly flat.
Mostly flat.
High value. I'm set. This is the place.
I did think that whisper of "this is the place" was an interesting choice. I mean, it's one of the most iconic things that Brigham Young ever said, in my opinion, which it's very, it's not very inspiring, I guess. It's just like, this is the I don't know. It's very observational, I guess. But he actually, I don't know if he said this at Fort Bridger. Brigham Young actually said this is the place about the Salt Lake Valley when the Saints first arrived, which is the same day that is celebrated by Pioneer Day. But the reason I like the character of Jim Bridger is because he's kind of a foil to Brigham Young. They are both these kind of high up leaders with a lot of power who are they're trying to outfox each other kind of throughout the show. I like that he's like, I'm getting a lay of the land, and he's like, it's mostly flat. And we see this kind of conversation back and forth between the two of them where they're both having a cordial conversation, but also kind of having a standoff between the two of them. I also think that Jim Bridger acts as a perfect criticism of Brigham Young. How often when Brigham Young is saying things like, I'll be back tomorrow, he notes out loud, I feel like you're threatening me. And Brigham Young, you know, is like, I'm not threatening you, but I am. So the dynamic between them was just fun to watch, and I think very well acted by the two actors in the scene. By the end of the show, like I said, already spoilers, so I hope I'm not ruining it for anyone, but Brigham Young does successfully buy the fort from Bridger and immediately tells him that his plan is to burn it to the ground. So he's not going to use it as a trading post or to add on to it and make it a city or something. He is going to burn it to the ground. The reason being that he wants to increase the level of isolation that the Mormons are afforded by living in their territory. We see throughout the show that the military is using Fort Bridger as a post and as a place for them to increase their presence and, you know, get supplies and stuff. And so it's basically posed as Brigham Young wants to burn this post to the ground as a way for the Mormons to be more isolated and to make it so it's more difficult to go west for anyone, whether it's settlers or the United States government. This is somewhat accurate, though the timeline here is a bit off. So in 1855, Mormons took control of Fort Bridger. They bought it from Jim Bridger for $8,000 in gold, and by 1857, Bridger was no longer at the fort. So this interaction, as it's shot here, didn't take place in its, you know, in pure history. This is kind of a fabricated timeline of events, but the pieces are kind of still the same. Fort Bridger, though, was burned by the Mormons during the Utah War in order to prevent its use by advancing troops. And so that aspect of burning it in order to increase the Saints' level of isolation and protection is true. I wanted to conclude with this final conversation between one of the Mormons represented in the show named Abish. She's Sister Pratt. We've seen, you know, you kind of watch her story throughout the show. And then also with Winterbird, who is a woman that is the chief of the Shoshone tribe depicted in the show. So this is a conversation between the two of them that felt like an important aspect of the show to highlight.
Why do you think your people have so much hunger to kill?
Fear, I think, of what they don't understand.
This valley was filled with so many Shoshone. But hunger and war and sick changed our world. And I do wonder if so much change, can we survive?
I think that fear as a theme motivating the characters throughout was really well done to show, and I think it adds to a lot of the humanity of all of the groups involved, where you can see how everyone is acting out of self-interest, but is also acting out of fear. And I think that it allows the characters, whether Mormon or not, or the Shoshone or anyone depicted in the show, this element of fear as a driving factor to commit violence is just a really fascinating moral question raised by the show. Her question at the end there, where she says, "Can we survive?" is one that I think is a really important question to be raised. Obviously, as I said from the outset, the Native Americans who were in Utah were very thoroughly, completely colonized. Most of them were either driven out, killed, or enslaved, are the kind of three most common outcomes of the Native American tribes and the indigenous people who lived in Utah at the time the Mormons first started showing up. I think one of the things that frustrates me the most about the Mormon approach to a story like this is that it claims persecution without any mention or recognition of the persecution, the persecuting, that it's also taken part in. If you want to read a really well done summary of the relationship, not just in the Mountain Meadows Massacre or during the Utah War, just kind of a summary of the involvement between Mormons and Native Americans, I suggest reading this Wikipedia page. And to me, one of the most chilling and horrible statistics on this page that I read a while ago, and it's just really been seared into my mind, is that in 1890, Native Americans made up only 1.6% of Utah's population. And so the idea that in those decades of Mormons first arriving in the Salt Lake Valley to the 1890s, only 1.6% of the people who lived in Utah were Native American. And to me, that's why when I go to a celebration like Pioneer Day, and there's no recognition of the persecution that Mormons brought to Native Americans, but a huge focus on the persecution that the US government brought to Mormons, it just feels like a lie. It feels like a half-truth. It feels very self-interested. It's a self-interested history. History is written by the victors. And for a religion so obsessed with truth and saying, we have the truth, we love the truth, we seek the truth, we're truth seekers, these are things I said. To say all of that and to not seek any real truth that is disfavorable to your own narrative, it's disingenuous, it's hypocritical, and it's one of the reasons people feel like the Mormon church is all about public perception and all about making themselves look good rather than sticking to an honest recounting of events at all costs and just saying, we're going to tell the truth of our history. We're going to tell it fully. We're not going to say some died. We're going to tell the full truth and nothing but the truth. And that to me is the frustration that I feel upon watching American Primeval and then also seeing the Mormon reaction to it, is that my upbringing in the church doesn't feel like it was centered around truth seeking, but around faith promoting. And those are two different missions and they lead you in different places. And that's why so many members choose to leave once they're adults and they can read as much history as they please and they can do as they please because they have their own apartment and they're away from their parents, because for the first time in their life they can really look at the truth and not just passively consume the whitewashed, sanitized version of the history that is presented at Sunday school. That concludes my reaction to American Primeval. I have to say there was so much more I could have included, whether just from a Mormon perspective or speaking to all of the aspects of the show that aren't Mormon. This felt like a rabbit hole that I could probably fall down forever. And so if there's anything I didn't share or get to, please drop it in the comments. I really liked the other storylines. I felt like the whole thing was really compelling to watch, if not gory. If you've seen it and there's an aspect of the show that I didn't get to that you feel like you want to bring to the forefront, please drop a comment below, or if you have any questions. I'll put a ton of resources in the notes below if you want to go click through. One note, if you're ever clicking through Wikipedia, I always suggest checking out the footnotes, looking at original sources. I obviously love Wikipedia as a great source for summary. It's really just a jumping off point for research, and it serves as a good summary, but it's not the end-all be-all of learning about a certain topic. So definitely check out the articles and the resources I've linked below, or share some in the comments if there's something that you feel is important that I didn't share, which I fully know I didn't get to everything that is pertinent to the show. Thank you so much for watching, and just a reminder to like this video, subscribe to my channel. Next week we're talking about the Pearl of Great Price, the Book of Abraham, Mormonism's relationship with Egypt, of all things, and we are going there. So like and subscribe, don't forget to drop a comment, and as always, I will see you all next week.